He knelt before her. The Duke of Ashenfall, a man who had never bowed before anyone, not even kings who demanded it, was on one knee, on the cold marble floor, a ring box open in his steady hand. His gray eyes looking up at her, with something that had no business being on the face of a man like him, sincerity. The grand hall was still. His steward stood frozen by the doorway. The evening candles burned low around them, casting the room in a warm amber glow that made the diamond in the ring look like captured firelight. He had planned this moment carefully. He had thought about every word. He had rehearsed nothing. Because for the first time in his life, he wanted every word to come from somewhere real. Eve, his voice was steady, deep, unhurried. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people, and I have never once felt less alone than I do when you are in the room. He paused, letting the truth of it settle in the air between them. I do not want to spend another day pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than what it is. You have shown me a version of myself I did not believe existed. His jaw tightened slightly. I would like to spend the rest of my life becoming that man, but only if you are beside me. He held the ring up. Will you marry me? For a moment, just one breathless, suspended moment, the room felt like it was holding the most beautiful possibility in the world. Then he saw her face change. It was not joy. It was not surprise in the way he had hoped for. It was something far more complicated and far more painful. A grief that moved across her features like a shadow crossing still water. Her eyes filled slowly, not dramatically, but deeply. The way eyes fill when tears come from somewhere that has been quietly hurting for a very long time. Her lips parted, closed again. She pressed her fingers together. That small, familiar gesture she always made when she was steadying herself. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I cannot marry you, your grace. He did not move. Eve, I am a nun. 3 words, quietly spoken, and yet they hit the entire room like a stone, dropped into absolute silence. The ripples spreading outward, reaching the walls, reaching his steward, reaching every burning candle, reaching the very floor beneath his knee. He stayed where he was, the ring still open in his palm, his face unreadable in the way faces go unreadable. When the mind is processing something, it fundamentally refuses to accept. A nun, she was a nun. The woman he had rearranged his entire world for. The woman who had sat across from him in this very hall and spoken about dignity and worth and the quiet power of a life lived with intention. The woman who had, without ever raising her voice, dismantled every careless belief he had carried since boyhood. The woman he had chosen, truly chosen, perhaps for the first time in his life, was a nun. A tear escaped down her cheek. Then another. She did not look away from him. She stood perfectly still and let him see every bit of what this moment was costing her. And somehow that honesty, that quiet devastation on her face was the most heartbreaking thing of all, because it told him everything. She had not been indifferent. She had not been simply performing her duty or fulfilling some mission of virtue. Whatever had grown quietly between them in those long evenings by the fire, in those unhurried conversations that stretched well past the hour she should have left, it had been real, for both of them, and it could not be slowly. The Duke of Ashenfall rose from his knee. He did not slam the ring box shut. He did not turn away. He simply stood before her, tall, still, unraveling quietly on the inside, and looked at the woman he could not have. How long have you known? He asked at last. His voice was low, careful, like a man choosing his steps on uncertain ground. She closed her eyes briefly. From the beginning. The silence that followed was enormous. There were 100 things he wanted to say, 100 accusations and questions and desperate arguments forming behind his eyes. But he said none of them, because the tears on her face were already saying the one thing that mattered most. She had not wanted it to end this way either. But how had they arrived here at all? How had a simple church mission brought a woman sworn to God into the halls of the most complicated man in Ashenfall? How had he, a man who had never once taken anything seriously, ended up on his knees with his whole heart in his hand? To understand that, You would have to go back to where it all began. To a warm afternoon on the outskirts of town. To a circle of young women, listening intently to a voice that was unlike any voice he had ever heard. To a duke who was simply passing by. Restless, bored, entirely unprepared. To the first moment he saw her, and could not look away. Chapter 1. Ashenfall was not the kind of place that expected much to happen. It was a prosperous town, certainly. Wide cobblestone streets, a bustling merchant quarter, estates that sat behind iron gates like quiet declarations of old money, but it moved at a measured pace. The same faces appeared at the same gatherings. The same conversations circled the same drawing rooms. The nobility here had long since run out of ways to surprise one another, which was precisely why the arrival of the young woman from the cathedral caused the kind of quiet stir that Ashenfall was entirely unprepared for. She came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. No grand carriage, no entourage of attendants, no announcement of any kind. Just a modest covered cart that rolled through the east gate. With the quiet confidence of someone who had not come to impress anyone, the church project on the north end of town had been awaiting a supervising representative from the cathedral for weeks, and here she was, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a calm, unhurried manners that seemed entirely out of place in a town that measured importance by how loudly one arrived. Her name was Eve. She was given lodging in the small cottage beside the church grounds. Simple a narrow bed, a writing desk by the window, and she settled into them without complaint. By the following morning, she had already introduced herself to the site workers, reviewed the construction plans, made 3 quiet corrections to the stonework schedule, and endeared herself to the elderly site manager who had fully expected to be difficult with whoever the cathedral sent. She had that effect on people. Quietly, without effort, without strategy, she simply made people feel seen. And in a town like Ashenfall, where most people were very good at looking straight through one another, that was a rare and remarkable thing. But Eve had not come to Ashenfall only for the building project. She was, at her core, a woman of mission, and wherever she went, the mission followed, not as a burden she carried, but as a natural extension of who she was. Within her first week, she had already begun to notice what she always noticed in every new place she was sent: the young women, the ones who moved through their days without anchor, without direction, without anyone taking the time to speak plainly to them about who they were and what they were worth. And so she began, as she always did, to gather them. It started simply enough. A conversation here, a kind word there. Word moved the way it always does among young women, quietly, quickly, reliably. By the second week, there was a small group of them meeting with her on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the open field behind the old chapel, sitting in a loose circle on the grass, while the afternoon light came down through the trees in long golden columns. Eve sat among them, never above them, always among them, and she talked about worth, about the kind of self-respect that does not depend on whether anyone is watching, about the difference between a woman who knows her value and a woman who is still waiting for someone else to tell her what it is. She spoke plainly, without performance, without the rehearsed formality of a sermon. And the young women listened in the way people listen when they're hearing something they have always felt, but never had the words for. She dressed, as always, with quiet modesty, not in her formal habit. She rarely wore it outside the cathedral walls, preferring instead the kind of simple, well-fitted garments that covered her completely without announcing themselves. A long dress in deep blue, a light shawl across her shoulders, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a modest covering. Nothing extravagant, nothing intended to draw attention. And yet, there was something about Eve that clothing could not conceal and modesty could not diminish. It was not something easily named or pointed to, not in the way one might point a fine jawline or an elegant figure, though she had both. It was more the way she held herself, the stillness in her, The way her eyes, when they landed on you, made you feel that she was genuinely, completely present, not thinking about the next thing, not measuring you against someone else, simply there, fully and unhurriedly there. It was the kind of beauty that did not announce itself. It waited quietly until you looked, and then it was simply undeniable. On a warm Thursday afternoon, in the third week of her Fae stay, that beauty introduced itself to the Duke of Ashenfall entirely without his permission. His name was Edmund Castle, Duke of Ashenfall, Lord of the Northern Reaches, heir to a name that commanded rooms before he entered them. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of angular face that looked like it had been designed specifically to make women forget what they were about to say. He rode well, dressed well, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who has never once had to try very hard for anything. He was also, by any honest account, entirely too comfortable with the company of women. Not in a cruel way. Edmund was not cruel. He was charming, genuinely, effortlessly charming. And that was almost worse, because it meant the women who fell for it could never quite bring themselves to be properly angry about it afterwards. He moved through them the way a warm wind moves through an open field. Pleasant while it lasted, gone before you quite registered it had arrived. There were no lasting wounds, simply a long trail of women in Ashenfall, and beyond who had spent longer than they should have, hoping he might look back. He never did, not once, not with any real intention. He had a horse named Conquest, which everyone agreed said a great deal about him. On that particular Thursday afternoon, he was riding back from the northern boundary of his estate. No particular urgency, no particular destination, simply the kind of aimless ride a restless man takes when his own company has begun to bore him. He had been in a vaguely dissatisfied mood all week, without being able to explain why. The usual entertainments had felt flat. The usual conversations had felt thin. He had found himself more than once sitting in his grand library staring at the fire with the uncomfortable feeling that something was missing, though he could not have said what. He came around the bend in the road that ran alongside the old chapel field with his usual unhurried pace, and then he stopped. It was the sound that reached him first. Soft laughter, genuine, unperformed laughter, rising up from the field to his left. He turned his head, more out of reflex than interest, and saw the group of young women sitting in their circle in the grass. He recognized some of them. Daughters of merchants and miners' owners, the kind of girls he had seen at various gatherings over the years, without ever particularly noticing. But it was not any of them that stopped him. It was the one sitting slightly forward in the circle, her back partially turned to him, voice speaking not quite milk out from the road, but that somehow the bomb carried the quality of something worth listening to. She wore deep blue. Her posture was perfect, not stiffly so, but with a kind of natural uprightness that comes from a person who is genuinely comfortable in themselves. A light shawl sat across her shoulders. Her hair was covered. He could not see her face fully. He could not see much of her at all. Truthfully, she was well covered, simply dressed, entirely unadorned. By every conventional measure, there was nothing here designed to catch his eye. And yet he had not moved. Conquest shifted beneath him. Edmund did not notice. He was watching her turn slightly to respond to something one of the young women said, watching the line of her profile emerge. For just a moment, the easy grace of her expression, the way she laughed quietly at whatever the girl had said and then leaned forward to respond with obvious care. And something happened in his chest that he was entirely unequipped to identify. It was not desire. He knew desire. He was fluent in desire. This was something quieter and more confusing than desire, number. Something closer to the feeling of suddenly noticing a door in a room you have lived in your whole life. Who is that? The question arrived before he had decided to form it. He sat on his horse at the edge of the road for a moment, longer than was entirely dignified, then turned and rode toward his estate with the expression of a man who has just been mildly unsettled by something he cannot explain. and fully intends to forget about by morning. He did not forget about it by morning. By the following afternoon, he had made 3 separate inquiries. His steward knew only that there was a young woman from the cathedral overseeing the church project. A merchant near the east gate knew her name, Eve, and that she was polite and paid promptly for anything she purchased. A housemaid who lived near the chapel grounds knew rather more. That she gathered young women in the field on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That she was well-spoken and kind. That nobody seemed to know very much about her background. And that she had a quality about her that was quite difficult to describe, but that you noticed immediately. And did not forget easily. None of this information satisfied the Duke in the way he had hoped it would. Normally, a few simple facts were enough to reduce a curiosity to a manageable size. Normally, knowing the name and the outline of a thing made it smaller. Eve, apparently, did not follow the normal rules. On Friday morning, he sent 2 of his guards to the chapel field. It was a Tuesday. The circle was assembled. Eve was midway through a thought about the difference between a woman who speaks her truth quietly and a woman who has simply been quieted, when a shadow fell across the edge of the group, and the murmuring began. 2 men in the Duke's livery stood at the edge of the field. One of them cleared his throat with the self-important manner of someone who has been told they are on official business. The young woman, Eve. He said it like a question wearing the close of a statement. His Grace the Duke of Ashenfall requests your presence. The circle went very still. Then, with the slow turning of multiple heads, every young woman in the group looked at Eve. She looked back at the guards with an expression of polite, unhurried composure. Not flustered, not flattered, simply present. As assessing the situation with the calm of someone who does not default to panic. I am in the middle of something, she said pleasantly. The guard blinked. This was apparently not a response he had been prepared for. His Grace. I heard you. Her voice was gentle but carried a quiet finality. Please tell His Grace that I will come when I have finished. She held the guard's uncertain gaze without difficulty. It will not be long. The guard looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at the guard. Neither of them had ever relayed this particular kind of message to the Duke before. She turned back to the circle and resumed her thought, exactly where she had left it. The young women stared at her with a mixture of admiration and barely concealed delight. Around the edges of the circle, however, a few of the older girls had already rearranged their expressions into something less generous, eyes moving over Eve with the sharp, measuring quality of women who have just understood that there is a competition they were not informed of. 20 minutes later, Eve folded her hands in her lap, looked around the circle with a warm smile and said, same time on Thursday. Then she rose, smoothed her skirt, picked up her satchel, and walked calmly toward the 2 guards who had been standing at the edge of the field this entire time doing absolutely nothing. One of them had the distant expression of a man rethinking his career. They brought her to the Duke at the edge of his estate grounds, where he had apparently decided, with great casualness, to simply be standing near the stone gate when she arrived, as though he had not given any instructions about it and simply happened to be there. He was taller than she had registered from the road. Well built, the kind of man who occupied space without seeming to try. He was watching her approach with an expression of composed interest, and when she stopped before him with her hands folded and met his gaze with the same unhurried calm she brought to everything, something shifted in his expression. Too quickly for most people to catch it. He had not expected the eyes. He had not expected the way she looked at him. Not with the flattered, slightly breathless quality he was entirely accustomed to receiving from women in Ashenfall, but with simple, steady, unimpressed attention, like a woman who saw clearly and intended to go on, seeing clearly, regardless of who was standing in front of her. You must be Eve, he said. And you must be the Duke, she replied, with a politeness so even that it was impossible to tell whether there was anything underneath it. He almost smiled. Almost. You kept my men waiting. I was not finished, she said simply. I hope that was not an inconvenience. He studied her for a moment. Up close she was. There was no other word for it. Striking. Not in the elaborate, carefully assembled way of the women who came to his estate for dinners and gatherings, not painted or powdered or dressed, to catch the light, simply, completely, almost unfairly strikings. In the way of something that does not know, it is beautiful and therefore carries the beauty without any of the performance. What is it you are teaching them? He asked. Those young women. She looked at him without blinking. How to know their worth. A beat of silence. That is an unusual curriculum, he said. It is a necessary one, she replied. He held her gaze. She held his. Neither of them looked away for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a first conversation between strangers had any business lasting. Then around the edges of his awareness, he heard it. The low murmur of voices from behind the gate, where a handful of the young women from the circle had apparently followed at a distance and were now watching this exchange with the dedicated attention of people with nothing more important to do. Several of the expressions he could see past the iron bars were not, strictly speaking, friendly. He ignored them. I would like to continue this conversation, he said. I am hosting a small gathering at the estate tomorrow evening. I would like you to come. Eve looked at him for a measured moment, then, why? He paused. It was not a question he was frequently asked. Because I find your perspective interesting. She considered this with the seriousness of someone who was genuinely weighing it, which was itself unusual. Most people accepted his invitations before he had finished extending them. I will think about it, she said, and before he could respond, she gave him a small, courteous nod and turned to walk back across the field, satchel over her shoulder, posture perfectly composed, entirely unbothered. He stood at the gate and watched her go. Behind him, his steward appeared at his elbow and said nothing, which was the steward's very practiced way of having a great deal to say. Send word to prepare the east sitting room for tomorrow evening. The Duke said, still watching the distance where Eve had been. Of course, Your Grace. A pause. Shall I inform Lady Sandra that the— No. The steward said nothing further. Edmund turned and walked back toward the estate with his hands behind his back, and the expression of a man who has just made a decision he does not yet fully understand. In the field behind the chapel, 3 young women were still watching the gate with narrowed eyes and the particular stillness of people quietly rearranging their priorities. And in the small cottage beside the church grounds, Eve set down her satchel, sat at the writing desk by the window, and looked out at the late afternoon light for a long quiet moment before opening her Bible and pressing her hands flat against the page. She did not read. She simply sat very still and breathed the way a person breathes when they are trying to remind themselves of something important. She would go to the estate just once, she told herself, just to be polite. She had, after all, told him she would think about it, and she had. Chapter 2. She came the following evening. She arrived without fuss. No borrowed gown, no attempt to dress above herself, simply the same quiet modesty she wore everywhere. A deep green dress, her hair covered, her satchel over her shoulder as though she might need to leave at any moment. She walked into the Duke's estate the way she walked into every room, without performance, without nerves, simply present. Edmund had invited 3 other guests to avoid the appearance of anything intentional. By the end of the first hour, he had forgotten they were there. There was something about the way Eve spoke, setting, in a private setting that was different from the field. In the field, she was a teacher. Here, across a small table with tea going cold between them, she was simply herself. Curious, unhurried, direct without being unkind. She asked him questions nobody asked him. Not about his lands or his title or his opinion of the northern trade routes. She asked him what he believed, what he valued, what kind of man he thought he was when nobody was watching. He answered more honestly than he intended to. She did not seem surprised by any of it. She came back the following week. And the week after that, there was no formal arrangement, no scheduled visits. no standing invitation. And yet somehow, with the natural rhythm of something that had decided to exist, the visits continued, sometimes in the east sitting room over tea, sometimes walking the estate grounds in the late afternoon, when the light came low and golden through the trees, sometimes simply sitting in the library in comfortable silence while she read, and he pretended to. She never stayed past a reasonable hour. She never gave him reason to misunderstand the nature of what this was. And yet the Duke found himself increasingly structuring his days around the hours she might appear, turning down evening engagements he would previously have attended without thought, sending his usual stream of female company away with polite excuses. That surprised his steward greatly. It was in those hours with Eve that something began to shift in him. Slowly, the way large things shift, with no single dramatic moment but a steady accumulation of small ones. She talked about women differently than anyone had ever talked about them in his presence. Not abstractly, not sentimentally, but plainly, the way one talks about something whose value is simply self-evident and requires no argument. She talked about what it cost a woman to be treated as entertainment, what it did, quietly and over time, to a person who was never taken seriously. She did not lecture him. She did not accuse. She simply spoke the truth in that clear, even voice of hers, and somehow the truth landed differently when it came from her, not as criticism, but as an invitation to see something he had been looking away from. He thought about women he had charmed and moved on from. He thought about them differently than he ever had before. He did not tell Eve this, but she seemed to know. "You are not a careless man by nature," she told him one evening, looking at the fire rather than at him. "You have simply never been asked to be careful." He was quiet for a long time after that. "Who taught you to see people this way?" he asked eventually. She smiled at the fire. It was a small smile, private, carrying something in it he could not read. "I had good teachers," she said simply. He did not push further. He was learning, gradually, that Eve had an interior life she kept well-tended and mostly private. A depth to her that revealed itself only in small portions, as though she was always aware of an invisible line she would not cross. He respected it, which itself surprised him. He was not accustomed to respecting limits, but with Eve, everything was different from what he was accustomed to. He did not notice exactly when his feelings changed. That was the nature of it. There was no moment he could point to and say, "There, that was when it happened." It was more like waking up one morning and realizing the season had changed while you were indoors. He simply knew, one quiet evening in the library, watching Eve turn a page with that particular care she gave to everything, that he had not thought about another woman in weeks, that the restless dissatisfaction that had followed him for years had gone somewhere he could not locate, that he was, in the simplest and most unfamiliar sense of the word, content, and that the contentment had everything to do with her. It was deeply inconvenient. It was also, he suspected, entirely irreversible. What Edmund had not thought about carefully enough, or rather, had been deliberately not thinking about, was Lady Sandra. Lady Sandra Ashmore was everything Ashenfall considered ideal in a woman of noble standing. She was tall, graceful, immaculately dressed, in the way of someone who had been trained since childhood to understand the power of presentation. She had fine features and an excellent bloodline, and a composure that never cracked in public. She had also, for the better part of 2 years, been operating under the reasonable expectation that she would one day be the Duchess of Ashenfall. This expectation had not been pulled from nowhere. Edmund had made certain implications, not a formal proposal, never that, but enough. Enough that her family had quietly begun making plans. Enough that she had turned down 2 other suitable offers. Enough that his continued delays had shifted in her mind from uncertainty to something that required an explanation. She had sent word requesting to see him 6 times in as many weeks. He had found reasons to be unavailable for every single one. The 7th time, she did not send word. She arrived. He came down the main staircase one afternoon, to find Lady Sandra standing in his entrance hall with her hands folded and an expression of extraordinary composure that was doing visible work to contain something considerably less composed underneath it. She was objectively a beautiful woman. He had always known that. She stood in his hall in a deep burgundy gown that had cost more than most men in Ashenfall. Earned in a year, her dark hair dressed perfectly, her chin level, her eyes steady on him as he descended the stairs. Sandra, he kept his voice even. Edmund. A pause, precise as a scalpel. You are a difficult man to find available. He reached the foot of the stairs and gestured toward the sitting room. Come in. She followed him. She sat. She accepted the offer of tea with the kind of automatic courtesy that lives in the hands while the mind is occupied elsewhere. And then she set the cup down and looked at him with eyes that were done with patience. There is a girl, she said. Not a question. Edmund said nothing immediately. I have heard her name spoken 3 times in a single week. Lady Sandra continued, her voice perfectly level, which he knew meant she had heard it considerably more than 3 times. A young woman from the cathedral. Modest, well-spoken. Nobody quite knows much about her. A beat. Except that she visits you regularly. She does, he said, because lying to Sandra had never been something he could manage. She was far too intelligent for it, and he had always known it. Something moved briefly across her face. Controlled immediately, but he had seen it. And what is she to you? He looked at the woman across from him, this elegant, accomplished, entirely deserving woman who had done nothing wrong, who had waited with more grace than he had any right to expect, who had built quiet plans around a future he had allowed her to believe in. And he told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I care for her, he said, in a way I did not anticipate and cannot dismiss. The room was very quiet. I see. Lady Sandra's voice had not changed in pitch or volume. This was somehow harder to witness than if it had. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. And the arrangement between our families? I will speak to your father personally, he said. I will ensure that nothing of this reflects on you in any way that causes you difficulty. You have my word on that. Your word, she repeated it without expression. I am sorry, Sandra. And he meant it. Genuinely, fully meant it. Perhaps for the first time understanding what it cost a person to be on the receiving end of a door quietly closing. You deserve better than what I have given you. She was silent for a long moment. Then she rose, smoothed her gown with the practiced ease of a woman who had been trained never to let anyone see her stumble, and picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. I hope, she said at the door, without turning around, that whoever she is worth it. She left without waiting for his answer. Edmund stood in the empty sitting room for a long time after the sound of her carriage had faded. He thought about what she had said. He thought about Eve, about the way she looked at the fire when she was thinking, about the sound of her voice in a quiet room, about the line she kept so carefully between them, and why, always why. He had no answer for Sandra's question yet, but he intended to find one. In a house across town, Lady Sandra sat at her writing desk and did not cry. She was far too well trained for that. But her hands, when she picked up her pen, were not entirely steady. And somewhere across Ashenfall, in a small cottage beside the church grounds, Eve knelt beside her narrow bed in the evening, quiet and prayed with the focused intensity of someone fighting a battle entirely on the inside. Neither woman slept well that night, and the Duke, for his part, sat by the fire until it burned completely to ash, thinking about a door he had already decided to walk through, entirely unaware of what was waiting on the other side. Chapter 4. The days after the proposal had a particular quality to them, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. The way air gets heavy before a storm that takes a long time coming. Edmund moved through his estate like a man fulfilling obligations in a dream. He attended to his correspondence. He met with his land steward. He appeared at the one dinner engagement he could not reasonably cancel, and said the right things to the right people, and came home early. Nobody who did not know him well would have noticed anything different. His steward noticed. Mrs. Holt noticed. And somewhere across Ashenfall, in a small cottage beside the church grounds, Eve noticed the quality of her own days too, and found them changed in ways she could not simply pray away, though she tried with considerable dedication. She had gone back to her work. The church project was entering its final phase, and there were decisions requiring her attention and correspondence to send to the field on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sat in their circle waiting for her voice to settle something in them. She gave them everything she had, and in the quiet hours, the early mornings before the town woke, the evenings after the candle had burned low, she sat with what she had done and looked at it honestly, the way she had always looked at hard things. She had stayed too long. She had told herself repeatedly and creatively that the friendship was simply friendship, and that her vows were intact, and that nothing was crossing any line that mattered. She admitted in the stillness of those quiet hours. Not entirely truthful with herself, she had known, perhaps not from the beginning, but certainly for a long time, that Edmonds were becoming something that a friendship could not contain. She had told herself that she could manage it, that she could hold the line without drawing it clearly, that she could continue to be useful to him without the situation becoming what it had become. She had been wrong, and now she had to live honestly with that. With the tears she had cried on the walk home from the estate, with the way his face had looked when she said the words, with the complicated grief of having genuinely changed someone, and then having to leave before you could see who they became, she wrote the letter to the cathedral on a Thursday evening. It was not a long letter. She did not dramatize, and she did not excuse. She stated plainly that during her time in Ashenfall, she had formed an attachment that was incompatible with her vows, that nothing irreversible had occurred, but that she could not in good conscience continue her service without full transparency. She requested guidance. She offered her resignation if the cathedral deemed it necessary. She sealed the letter, set it on the desk, and sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the window for a long time. Then she picked up her Bible. And this time, she read. The response from the cathedral came within the week. They were, as she had known they would be, disappointed. The language was measured and pastoral, but the weight behind it was not. She had been trusted with a mission and had allowed something to grow in the space that trust had created. Several senior members of the cathedral had written individual notes. Some were kind, some were not. Her resignation was accepted. She read the final letter, sitting at her small desk in the cottage with the morning light coming through the window and the sound of the construction caissons. The project she had come here to oversee, nearly finished. Now, its stones rising clean and solid against the sky. She had built something here. Several things, in fact. Some of them she was leaving behind. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in her satchel and sat quietly for a moment. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and went to oversee the final day of construction with the same unhurried attention she had brought to the very first. Edmund heard about the resignation the same afternoon through the particular network of information that flows through a town like Ashenfall, whether anyone intends it or not. He sat with the information for a long time before doing anything about it. Then he went to her. He found her at the completed church, standing at the entrance, looking up at the finished stonework, with an expression he could not fully read from where he stood. She heard his footsteps and turned, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the courtyard, with everything that had happened and sitting in the air between them too large and too complex to summarize. He stopped a few feet from her. You resigned, he said. Yes, because of me. She considered denying it. He could see her consider it. Then yes, he exhaled slowly. Eve, I never wanted. I know. She said it gently but with finality. I know you didn't, and I am not placing that at your door. She looked at him steadily. I made my own choices. I stayed when perhaps I should not have. That is mine to carry, not yours, sis. He looked at her, at the composure she was wearing like armor, at the quiet exhaustion underneath it that only someone who had been watching her carefully for months would be able to see, and something in him that had been building since the evening in the grand hall. A pressure, a desperation dressed in logic, rose to the surface. "Then let me make it right," he said. "The proposal stands. Everything I said that evening, nothing has changed in it. I meant every word, and I mean it still." He took a step closer. "You are no longer bound by the cathedral's expectations. There is nothing standing between Edmund." Her voice was very quiet. "Listens to me. I have resigned my position," she said. "I have not resigned my faith. I have not resigned my vows in here." She pressed one hand briefly to her chest. "And I will not. The cathedral releasing me from service does not release me from who I am." He was silent. "I am still a nun," she said, "in every way that matters to me. And I think you know me well enough by now to understand that I cannot be argued out of something I have carried my whole life." He did know that. He knew it completely, and that knowing made the conversation both clearer and harder. "So that is it," he said. "That is it." Her voice held a sadness that did not perform itself. "I am sorry. I am deeply, genuinely sorry for the parts of this that were my fault. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I am sorry that I—" She stopped briefly. "I am sorry," he nodded once, looked at the completed church. The clean new stone, the straight lines, the work she had overseen with such quiet precision. Something built well, in a place that had needed it. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Back to the cathedral first, then wherever I am sent." A small pause. "That has always been the nature of my life." He looked at her one last time, with the full, unhurried attention of a man storing something carefully. "You changed me," he said simply. "Whatever else this is, whatever it cost, I want you to know that. The man standing here is not the man you found in this town. And I did not know I needed that until you showed me what it looked like." Eve looked at him for a moment with those clear, steady eyes, and something in them shifted, warm and private and brief, like a candle in a window seen from a road. "I know," she said softly. "That is why none of this was easy." They stood for a moment longer, in the courtyard of the finished church, the morning light clean around them. The town of Ashenfall carrying on its ordinary life on all sides. Then she gave him the small, courteous nod she had given him that very first day, the one that meant, "Goodbye. For now," picked her satchel, and walked quietly away. He stood and watched her go. This time, he did not tell himself he would find a way. He did not form plans or arguments or strategies. He simply watched the woman who had walked into his life on an ordinary afternoon and changed every quiet thing in it, until she turned the corner and was gone, and the Duke of Ashenfall stood alone in the courtyard of a church he had never paid much attention to before, in a town that felt entirely different from the one she had arrived in, and understood something he had not understood before she came, that some people do not stay, that some people are sent into your life, into your blind spots, into the parts of yourself you had stopped bothering to look at, and do their work and leave. And the only honest response to that is not to hold on. It is to become fully and permanently what they helped you see. He stayed a while longer. Then he walked home. Eve left Ashenfall on a Tuesday morning. The same day of the week she had gathered her circle of young women in the field. Several of them came to see her off, standing at the east gate with the early light behind them, a little quieter than usual. She embraced each of them. She told them what she always told them at the end, that they already had everything they needed, that she had simply helped them see it, and that seeing it clearly was now their responsibility to keep. She climbed into the modest covered cart. She did not look back at the town as it carried her away, not because there was nothing worth looking back at, but because she trusted, the way she had always trusted, deeply and without performance, that what was real had already been planted, in the young women in the field, in the finished church standing clean against the skies, in a duke who had learned perhaps for the first time what it meant to love something you could not keep. The cart rolled through the gate. Ashenfall disappeared behind her, and Eve folded her hands in her lap, closed her eyes, and let the road take her wherever she was needed next.